The night of February 13th, 1945, pressed down heavy and silent over Dresden, its winter sky a dark canvas painted with faint stars. In a narrow street not far from the Altmarkt, a man stood at his window, breath fogging against the glass as he peered into the cold distance. He had lived through 6 long years of war, but his city, his beloved Florence on the Elbe, remained largely untouched, a sanctuary of beauty and culture, even as Germany crumbled all around it. Tonight, however, something felt different. Beneath the stillness came a low hum, a vibration in the bones rather than a sound. It grew steadily, multiplying until it was no longer a single note, but a rolling thunder spreading across the sky. Engines, hundreds of them. The sirens wailed, their mechanical screams slicing through the night. Mothers grabbed children from their beds, fathers hauled water buckets to the cellar stairs, and families clutched precious bundles of food, blankets, and documents before vanishing underground. The man at the window snatched his coat and bolted toward the shelter below. All across Dresden, the bells of fire stations clanged, and wardens shouted in the streets. The sky was coming alive with tiny specks of light, flares dropped by British pathfinders to mark the target. They floated gently, mockingly, above the rooftops, bathing the city in an eerie, unnatural daylight. The ground shuddered as the first bombs fell. At first, it was scattered explosions, dull thuds like giant fists slamming into the earth. Then came the roar, the rolling thunder as entire blocks erupted in orange flame. Roof tiles lifted as though plucked by unseen hands, windows blew inward, and walls buckled beneath the concussion. In the cellars, people screamed, not knowing whether to stay in place or run. The man pressed himself against the damp brick wall, dust showering down as the shelter above groaned under the impact. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if oxygen were being stolen from the lungs. Within minutes, fire took command of the city. Incendiary clusters, hundreds of thousands of small, magnesium-filled canisters, fell like rain. Each burst open on impact, spewing flames that clung to wood, to cloth, to flesh. Entire rows of houses ignited in seconds, flames racing through attics and collapsing stairwells. Families who had fled the shelters to escape suffocation found themselves caught in alleys where the air burned hotter than iron. A mother clutched her infant, running blindly, only to feel the gale of a firestorm dragging them toward the inferno. Witnesses would later recall how bodies were sucked into the blaze, lifted off their feet by hurricane-force winds created by the fire itself. Above, the night sky flickered with the silhouettes of Lancaster bombers, their engines steady, their bellies opening to release yet more cargo of death. One by one, they unleashed their payloads, turning Dresden into a furnace. The precision of destruction was uncanny, Pathfinder flares guiding the bombers with mathematical efficiency. Streets that had stood for centuries disappeared in waves of fire. The Zwinger Palace, the Semper Opera House, churches, libraries, and hospitals, all were engulfed without distinction. Inside the shelters, terror took on new shapes. Oxygen was being consumed faster than it could seep through the cracks. The air grew thin, thick with smoke. People pressed wet rags to their faces, but the flames outside drew the very breath from their lungs. Doors buckled outward as the pressure of the firestorm mounted. Some tried to force their way out, only to collapse in the fiery streets beyond. Others chose to stay, clinging to one another, whispering prayers drowned out by the cacophony above. Outside, the firestorm gathered into a single monstrous force. Temperatures soared to over 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass and fuse metal. Stone statues glowed red in the heat. Asphalt bubbled on the roads. Those who ran found their shoes sticking to the molten surface, the air so hot it scorched their throats with every breath. Entire tram lines sagged as the metal rails warped in the inferno. In the darkness, the city seemed to breathe. Each collapse of a building was like an exhalation, each new explosion like an inhalation. Dresden was alive, but it was the life of fire, consuming everything in its reach. Survivors who reached the open spaces of the Grossgarten believed they had found safety, but even there, sparks rained down like burning snowflakes. Trees crackled and roared, their branches transformed into torches. Families huddled in shallow craters, clutching one another, while the sky itself seemed aflame. For hours, the waves of bombers continued, one formation replaced by the next. More than 800 aircraft passed over Dresden that night, dropping nearly 2,700 tons of explosives and incendiaries. The city had become a single vast pyre, visible for miles, its glow reflected in the clouds above. By dawn, Dresden was unrecognizable. Where once stood Baroque streets and gilded spires now lay a smoking, smoldering ruin. Blackened shells of buildings jutted from the rubble, their interiors reduced to ash. Thousands of bodies littered the streets, many unrecognizable, reduced to charred silhouettes frozen in gestures of flight or embrace. In some shelters, rescuers found whole families preserved in death, as if asleep, their lungs seared by the heat. In others, nothing remained but piles of bone fragments and ash, the victims consumed by the furnace of their own refuge. The man who had stared from his window the evening before emerged at dawn. His house was gone. His neighbors vanished. He walked through streets where silence was broken only by the hiss of steam and the distant crash of collapsing masonry. He passed bodies twisted together, their faces unrecognizable but their desperation unmistakable. In that moment, he understood that Dresden was no longer the Florence on the Elbe, no longer the sanctuary untouched by war. It had become a graveyard of fire, its beauty annihilated in a single night. What unfolded in Dresden that night was more than an air raid. It was a demonstration of the industrial scale of destruction that modern warfare had made possible. Thousands of tons of bombs, manufactured in factories across Britain, guided by Pathfinder tactics refined over years, unleashed with mechanical precision upon a civilian city. The tragedy of Dresden was both deeply personal and chillingly impersonal, a convergence of human suffering and technological efficiency. And yet, as the smoke drifted upward, as the survivors stumbled through the wreckage, questions remained unanswered. Why Dresden? Why now? So late in the war, when Germany was already collapsing. What was gained, and what was lost, by the burning of this city? The answers lie in the deeper history of the Allied air campaign, in the evolution of strategic bombing that had turned once clear skies into instruments of terror. The story of Dresden is not just one of a single night, but of years of doctrine, of men in uniform and men in suits, of machines built for destruction, and of civilians who found themselves beneath their shadow. On the eve of its destruction, Dresden stood as one of Europe's most treasured cities, a place where the past seemed to linger untouched by the horrors consuming the continent. Along the banks of the Elbe River, church bells rang over a skyline of domes, spires, and gilded facades. The Frauenkirche's Baroque dome rose proudly above the city, while the Semper Opera House glowed in soft lamplight, promising music even in the midst of war. In the streets, trams rattled over cobblestones, cafes served steaming cups of coffee laced with chicory, and families clung to small rituals of normalcy. For those who had fled the advancing Red Army in the east, Dresden was a refuge, a city that still seemed to belong to an earlier world. To Germans, Dresden was known as the Florence on the Elbe, and with good reason. Its museums housed masterpieces by Raphael and Rembrandt. Its concert halls carried echoes of Wagner and Strauss, and its architectural wonders had stood for centuries as symbols of refinement and culture. Compared to the smoldering ruins of Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin, Dresden was a miracle, untouched, serene, and seemingly spared by fate. Visitors walking its promenades in early 1945 would have seen soldiers with bandaged arms convalescing in parks, children playing on frozen ponds, and refugees arriving in endless streams, their carts piled with possessions, their faces etched with exhaustion. But Dresden's beauty though genuine, concealed deeper realities. Beneath its baroque facades, the machinery of war hummed steadily. Small workshops and factories scattered throughout the city produced optical instruments, precision parts, and other military equipment vital to the German war effort. Dresden's rail yards served as a crucial hub in the Reich's transport network, funneling troops and supplies between east and west. The city's importance as a communications center was well known to the Allies, even if propaganda later painted Dresden as purely cultural and civilian. The truth was more complicated. Dresden was both a jewel of art and a cog in the machinery of war. Life for civilians in the winter of 1945 was marked by a strange combination of splendor and deprivation. Food rations grew ever smaller, and coal shortages forced families to huddle together in single rooms to keep warm. Yet theaters still performed, and orchestras still played to packed audiences desperate for a reprieve. In the evenings, when blackout curtains darkened the windows, the strains of violins and the murmur of conversation drifted through the city, as if to defy the notion that war could rob Dresden of its soul. For the refugees flooding in from Silesia and East Prussia, the city represented safety, though in truth it was already overburdened, its shelters and homes stretched to breaking point. The contrast was stark. In one quarter of the city, women and children queued for bread and potatoes, while in another, Dresden's elite gathered in salons to sip wine and discuss art. Soldiers home on leave mingled with families in the Christmas markets that had still flickered to life only weeks before, their wooden stalls adorned with candles and ornaments despite shortages. The illusion of peace lingered stubbornly here, as if the city refused to acknowledge the storm gathering around it. This illusion was reinforced by a widely held belief among Dresdeners that their city would never be attacked. Rumors whispered through the streets that the Allies would spare Dresden out of respect for its cultural heritage, its art collections, and its historic architecture. Others insisted that Roosevelt or Churchill had once visited Dresden before the war and declared it off-limits. There was comfort in these myths, repeated in cellars and cafes, even though no such promises had ever been made. In reality, Dresden's very lack of defenses, its inadequate flak batteries, its absence of fighter squadrons, made it vulnerable. And still, the city was full of life. The Elbe's waters glinted beneath bridges that had carried trade for centuries. Streetcars clanged as they passed the Frauenkirche, and the domes of the Hofkirche gleamed faintly in the winter sun. The Saxon State Library, the Zwinger Palace, and the Bruhl's Terrace stood as proud reminders of a lineage stretching back to kings and electors who had turned Dresden into a beacon of culture. Refugees, weary and cold, often stopped on their way into the city to marvel at its skyline, whispering that surely no one could destroy such beauty. But the war was closing in. By February 1945, Soviet armies were less than 100 miles from the city, their artillery beginning to echo across the eastern plains. The Wehrmacht, battered and retreating, clogged Dresden's rail stations with endless troop movements. Hospitals overflowed with wounded, the corridors lined with stretchers, and yet the sense of invulnerability persisted. Dresden still looked like a city out of a painting, its treasures preserved, its churches unscathed. It seemed impossible that in only days it would become a name synonymous not with beauty, but with devastation. The stage was set for tragedy. Dresden was not just a jewel of the Elbe. It was a city swollen with refugees, tied to the German war machine, and wrapped in the dangerous illusion that its cultural heritage made it untouchable. That illusion would shatter in fire, leaving behind not only ruins, but also one of the most bitter controversies of the Second World War. In the black skies over the Ruhr in 1942, a British bomber crew fought against fear and mathematics. Their Halifax droned steadily toward its target, but the night was alive with threats. Below, searchlights pierced the darkness, white beams crisscrossing until they locked onto the fuselage. Flak batteries roared, their shells bursting in brilliant orange blossoms around the aircraft. The crew felt the shudder of shrapnel tearing through aluminum skin, smelled the acrid tang of smoke, and heard the staccato chatter of machine gun fire from night fighters hunting in the gloom. They were one of hundreds dispatched, but already the losses were piling up. The arithmetic was brutal. Sorties that began with waves of aircraft often ended with charred wrecks scattered across German fields. By the end of that year, daylight precision bombing by the Royal Air Force had become unsustainable. Crews, often barely out of training, were being slaughtered in the skies. Something had to change. That change came in the form of a doctrine, one born not from idealism, but from necessity. The British had entered the war hoping to target specific factories, rail yards, and military facilities. But German defenses, strengthened by radar, flak, and agile night fighters, made such accuracy almost impossible. Precision was a noble aspiration, but in practice, most bombs missed their intended targets entirely. Reports revealed that in some raids, fewer than 1 in 5 aircraft dropped their payloads within 5 miles of the target. The cost in men and machines was staggering, and morale within Bomber Command sagged under the weight of near-suicidal missions. Into this crucible stepped Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, soon to be known as Bomber Harris. Appointed head of RAF Bomber Command in early 1942, Harris was blunt, unsentimental, and convinced that the war could be won not by small, precise strikes, but by overwhelming destruction. He championed area bombing, an approach designed not merely to cripple industry, but to crush the will of the German people. Harris argued that if entire cities could be burned to the ground, their factories, their infrastructure, and their civilian morale would collapse together. He was not a man of half measures. For him, the enemy's war machine was inseparable from its population centers. The industrial backbone of this new doctrine was the Avro Lancaster bomber. Sleek, durable, and capable of carrying colossal bomb loads, the Lancaster became the centerpiece of Harris's strategy. It could lift 14,000 pounds of bombs on long-range missions, and on shorter flights, carry the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slam earthquake bomb. Its 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines purred with a reliability that pilots came to trust, and its capacious bomb bay could be fitted with an array of ordnance, from high explosives designed to shatter buildings to incendiaries engineered to ignite infernos. Production lines across Britain poured out thousands of Lancasters, and crews came to revere the aircraft as both a lifeline and a weapon of terrible efficiency. But even the Lancaster needed guidance. Bombers dispatched into the night often struggled to find their targets amid the clouds and chaos of German defenses. Out of this problem emerged the Pathfinder Force, an elite group of squadrons whose task was to locate and illuminate targets for the main bomber streams. Flying ahead of the waves, Pathfinder crews dropped flares, nicknamed Christmas trees for their bright cascades, that marked factories, rail yards, and city centers with eerie brilliance. With this innovation, Bomber Command's accuracy improved dramatically. The glow of flares guided hundreds of following bombers, turning darkness into daylight and ensuring that destruction fell where it was intended. Then there were the incendiaries, the silent architects of firestorms. British chemists and engineers perfected small magnesium and phosphorus bombs that ignited at thousands of degrees, capable of setting rooftops, furniture, and even stone ablaze. These were not weapons designed for tactical strikes. They were designed to overwhelm firefighting services, to spread from attic to cellar until entire districts burned. When mixed with high-explosive bombs that tore open water mains and disrupted fire brigades, incendiaries created conditions ripe for firestorms. Conflagrations so intense they generated their own weather, sucking oxygen from the air and pulling flames across city blocks with hurricane force. Hamburg in 1943 became the first city to suffer such a fate. Its streets turned into rivers of fire, its civilians trapped in a furnace from which there was no escape. The Americans, by contrast, pursued a different doctrine, at least in theory. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, championed daylight precision bombing using the Norden bombsight. a sophisticated device that promised pinpoint accuracy. American crews flew in tight formations, relying on mutual defensive firepower to fend off German fighters. Their goal was to hit factories, oil refineries, and transport hubs with surgical precision. In practice, however, daylight raids exposed American bombers to devastating losses. The mission against Schweinfurt-Regensburg in 1943, aimed at crippling German ball-bearing production, ended in disaster. 60 B-17 flying fortresses were lost, and the factories were soon operating again. It became clear that neither doctrine, pursued in isolation, was decisive. British night bombing brought widespread devastation, but often lacked focus, while American daylight raids promised accuracy, but suffered crippling attrition. By late 1943 and into 1944, a grim synergy emerged. The British battered German cities by night, spreading fire and chaos, while the Americans struck by day, hammering oil facilities, aircraft factories, and transport networks. Together, they maintained around-the-clock pressure, a relentless cycle of destruction from which the Reich could not recover. This evolution of strategy, born of trial, error, and staggering sacrifice, reshaped the air war over Europe. The crews who flew these missions lived with constant peril, flak that shredded wings, fighters that preyed on stragglers, and the numbing cold of high-altitude flight. Survival rates were grim. For many, completing a full tour of missions was a near impossible feat. Yet thousands climbed into their bombers night after night, convinced that each sortie brought Germany one step closer to defeat. By early 1945, the doctrine of fire was firmly in place. Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force together wielded fleets of thousands of aircraft, supported by improved navigation, long-range escort fighters, and an industrial base that ensured a ceaseless supply of machines, fuel, and bombs. The stage was set for the final, most destructive acts of the bombing campaign. Cities that had long believed themselves safe, cities like Dresden, would soon discover what it meant to be at the center of this doctrine of annihilation. In a smoke-filled chamber in Whitehall in early 1945, maps stretched across long oak tables. Thin red lines marked the Soviet advance across Poland, now pushing toward the Oder River and the gates of Berlin. The Allied chiefs gathered in London and Washington studied the shifting front with a mixture of triumph and unease. Victory was close, but it carried with it new questions: how to hasten Germany's collapse, how to support the Soviet offensive, and how to demonstrate to friend and foe alike the scale of Allied might. Ashtrays overflowed, coffee cooled untouched, and fingers tapped restlessly on folders stamped "Most Secret." The discussion turned not to tanks or infantry, but to cities. German cities still standing, still functioning, and still offering shelter to millions. Among them, one name surfaced again and again: Dresden. By that winter, Germany's armies were collapsing. The Ardennes counteroffensive had failed. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and fuel shortages crippled movement. Yet Germany fought on, its people driven by propaganda and fear of surrender to the Soviets. For the Allies, destroying what remained of Germany's will to fight became a central aim. The logic of strategic bombing, already hardened into doctrine, now found a new target in the east. If cities deep within Germany, far from the front lines, could be obliterated, then civilians fleeing the Red Army would find no refuge, and German morale might shatter altogether. It was an argument as cold as it was calculated. The plan that emerged carried the name Operation Thunderclap. It envisioned a massive blow against Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, and other eastern cities. The goal was not only military disruption, but psychological terror, an unmistakable signal that nowhere in Germany was safe. Early drafts spoke of casualties in the hundreds of thousands, a demonstration of Allied air power so overwhelming that German surrender would be accelerated. Yet even among the planners, Thunderclap sparked debate. American commanders, schooled in the theory of precision strikes, balked at the sheer scale of civilian deaths it implied. British leaders, shaped by the trauma of the Blitz, believed in the power of terror from the sky. At the center of the argument, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris insisted that the war could be shortened if Germany's remaining cities were reduced to rubble. Churchill, Roosevelt, and their chiefs weighed these views against the realities of diplomacy. By February 1945, the Allies were gathered at Yalta, carving up the post-war order with Stalin. The Soviet leader pressed for measures to support his armies, now advancing in brutal winter fighting through East Prussia and Silesia. The Red Army bled daily, losing tens of thousands in its drive toward Berlin. Stalin demanded that the Western Allies strike deep into Germany's rear, crippling the rail lines and junctions feeding German divisions on the Eastern Front. Whether by coincidence or design, the cities targeted under Thunderclap overlapped with those requests. Dresden, sitting astride key railway corridors funneling troops and materiel to the east, became a name underlined on the map. While the debates raged in London and Washington, the reality in Dresden itself was starkly different. Tens of thousands of refugees arrived daily, trudging into the city on weary feet or crammed into railcars. The stations overflowed with the displaced, mothers clutching infants, children in patched coats, old men dragging carts piled high with bedding and heirlooms. Every square in the city seemed to host families sleeping under blankets or huddled against walls. Schools, churches, and gymnasiums were converted into makeshift camps. For them, Dresden was hope, a final sanctuary, a place spared thus far from the fate of Cologne, Hamburg, or Berlin. They did not know their sanctuary had already been circled in pencil in faraway rooms. Operation Thunderclap, as originally conceived, was never fully executed in its entirety. The scope was pared down, the notion of obliterating Berlin in one stroke set aside. Yet the thinking behind it, total destruction as a tool of war, remained intact. When the order was finally given to strike Dresden, it carried the DNA of Thunderclap. The mission briefing to RAF crews framed the attack as one to disrupt communications and aid the Soviets. Harris's staff spoke of smashing transport links, but the scale of the planned raids and the munitions loaded onto the Lancasters revealed a broader aim: to burn the city itself. As the planning tables emptied and officers returned to their quarters, the weight of decision hung in the air. Outside, in the frozen streets of Dresden, people queued for bread. Children played in the shadow of Baroque spires, and refugees sought warmth in overcrowded shelters. They lived unaware that across the Channel, their city had been chosen as a target, not only for what it contained, but for what its destruction would symbolize. The myth of Dresden's safety, the belief that its art and beauty would shield it from war, was about to meet the firestorm born in the cold arithmetic of strategy. The night of February 13, 1945, began with an unease that many Dresdeners could not name but felt nonetheless. It was a bitterly cold evening, the kind where frost clung to windows and the cobblestones rang hard under boots. Families descended into cellars, some out of habit, others from a sudden foreboding stirred by the wail of sirens. Above the city, the first British Pathfinder aircraft circled, their crews peering down into the darkness. Then came the flares, long canisters tumbling through the night sky, igniting into cascades of white, red, and green. They hung over Dresden like unnatural stars, bathing the Baroque skyline in ghastly light. For those looking upward, it was a moment of awe and terror, as if the heavens themselves had opened to pass judgment. At 10:03 p.m., the first wave arrived. Hundreds of Avro Lancasters, flying in tight formations, opened their bomb bays. High explosive devices dropped first, shattering roofs, ripping open streets, and breaking water mains. They smashed through walls and flattened apartment blocks, ensuring that the fires to follow would find ready fuel. Moments later, the incendiaries rained down, tens of thousands of small magnesium and phosphorus bombs designed not to explode with force, but to ignite with fury. They pierced rooftops and burst into white-hot flame, leaping from attics to stairwells, from furniture to curtains, until whole blocks glowed like torches. For those in the shelters, the terror grew with each passing second. The first concussions knocked dust from ceilings, filling the air with choking clouds. Then came the unmistakable heat, the realization that the fire outside was not contained but spreading, fed by winds that grew stronger as flames devoured oxygen. Survivors described it as if the air itself had turned into a living force, pulling at doors and windows, drawing men, women, and children into the inferno. Mothers clutched infants as they tried to flee, only to be hurled back by walls of heat. Families who chose to remain underground soon found their sanctuaries turning into ovens, the iron doors glowing red, the temperature rising beyond endurance. Above ground, chaos reigned. Fire brigades rushed into the streets only to be overwhelmed by the scale of the conflagration. Pumps ran dry as mains were shattered, and engines themselves burst into flame. The firestorm took command of the city, pulling oxygen into a vortex that roared like a hurricane. Temperatures soared to over 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass and fuse porcelain. Eyewitnesses later recalled seeing trees burst into flame spontaneously, asphalt bubbling on the streets, and tram lines sagging as metal rails warped in the heat. People trying to run found their shoes sticking to the molten surface, their lungs seared by every breath of superheated air. By midnight, much of Dresden's historic center was ablaze. The Frauenkirche, the Semper Opera House, the Zwinger Palace, all were caught in the storm. Entire neighborhoods disappeared, their outlines erased in a tide of fire. The glow was visible more than 100 miles away, pilots reporting the target marked so brightly they scarcely needed instruments. For the crews, the raid was another mission completed, logged and filed. For the city below, it was the beginning of a nightmare without end. Just as survivors stumbled into the open, believing the worst was over, the second wave came. At 1:23 a.m., more than 500 additional Lancasters swept in, guided by the glow of the still-burning city. They carried with them a fresh load of explosives and incendiaries, dropped with merciless precision into the already raging inferno. For the civilians who had escaped into the streets or gathered in parks and open spaces, the second raid was a death blow. Incendiaries fell upon crowds, scattering fire across those who had no shelter left. People were trapped between collapsing buildings and advancing walls of flame, their avenues of escape cut off by rubble and heat. Eyewitness accounts from that night convey the horror in fragments almost too vivid to imagine. One woman described being lifted off her feet by the gale-force winds of the firestorm, hurled against a wall, her clothes ignited as she fought to smother the flames. Another survivor recalled the silence in one shelter, where dozens of people had suffocated, their bodies unmarked, as if asleep, but stilled forever by the absence of oxygen. Elsewhere, rescuers found nothing but ash and bone, the victims consumed entirely by temperatures that left no trace of flesh. By dawn on February 14th, Dresden was a vision of the apocalypse. The city center lay in ruins, a vast, smoldering desert of rubble and flame. Smoke rose in black columns into the sky, blotting out the morning sun. Thousands of bodies lay strewn in streets and squares, some charred beyond recognition, others preserved in grotesque poses of flight or embrace. In the Altmarkt, rescue crews piled corpses in rows, numbering them in the thousands. For those who had survived the night, there was no relief, only silence punctuated by the distant crash of collapsing walls and the hiss of fire still consuming what remained. The first and second raids on Dresden were more than just military operations. They were acts that transformed a living city into a furnace. The tonnage dropped, nearly 2,700 tons of bombs and incendiaries in just a few hours, was staggering, but numbers alone could not capture the human toll. A city celebrated as the Florence on the Elbe had been reduced to ashes in a single night, and yet the nightmare was not finished. As survivors stumbled among the ruins, exhausted and hollow-eyed, another wave was already on its way. The morning of February 14, 1945, dawned over Dresden. In a haze of smoke, the city smoldered, its streets still glowing with embers from the firestorm that had consumed the night before. Survivors staggered through rubble, dazed, carrying children, searching for relatives, or standing motionless before the blackened shells of what had once been their homes. In the Altmarkt, heaps of bodies were already being gathered, a grim harvest from cellars and basements where whole families had suffocated. The air was thick with ash, a bitter taste coating the mouths of those who breathed it. For many, the worst seemed to have passed. They could not know that within hours, another blow was coming, one delivered in broad daylight, under a sky that should have promised relief. Across the Channel in England, American air crews of the 8th Air Force strapped into their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. They had been briefed that morning. Dresden, one of the few remaining large cities in eastern Germany, was now their target. Officially, the mission was to disrupt railways and marshalling yards, to sever the flow of troops and materiel heading east to fight the Soviets. The crews were told this was a precision raid, guided by the famed Norden bomb site, which promised accuracy to within a few hundred feet. But from their altitude of over 20,000 feet, through shifting winds and haze, precision was a relative concept. For the men at the controls, the orders were clear: fly the formation, release on the lead bomber's signal, and bring hell to Dresden. Shortly after noon, the American formations approached the city. Survivors on the ground first heard the distant growl of engines, different in tone from the Lancasters of the night before. The sound rolled across the ruined streets, and fear spread instantly among those who had dared emerge from cellars. Some scrambled back into half-collapsed shelters, others simply dropped where they stood, staring upward at the silver specks glinting against the pale winter sun. To those below, the sight was surreal. The city was already a smoking ruin, flames still flickering in gutted buildings, and yet fresh waves of bombers were descending upon it. At 12:17 p.m., the first bombs fell. Heavy, high explosives slammed into districts that were already shattered, toppling walls weakened by fire, crushing survivors who had survived the night's inferno. Clouds of dust rose over the city center, blotting out what little daylight penetrated the smoke. The raids came in waves, first one formation, then another, until nearly 300 American bombers had passed overhead. The targets listed in mission reports, railway stations, bridges, industrial yards, were indistinguishable from the chaos below. In practice, bombs scattered across residential districts, hospitals, and the very squares where rescue teams were gathering the dead. For those survivors who had endured the firestorm, the daylight raid was a blow beyond endurance. Rescue workers pulling charred bodies from cellars were themselves buried under fresh cascades of rubble. In open squares, refugees who had fled into the city during the night were caught in the open, their belongings hurled into the air by explosions. Eyewitnesses recalled the grotesque juxtaposition of statues still standing amid the ruins, stone figures of Saxon kings and saints towering above while the living were crushed beneath them. The sense of futility was overwhelming. The city was already destroyed, and yet the bombing continued. The American doctrine of daylight precision bombing was meant to contrast with the British philosophy of area bombing. In theory, it was more restrained, aimed at crippling industry rather than obliterating cities wholesale. But Dresden showed the limitations of theory. Haze, smoke, and the vast scale of destruction made precise targeting nearly impossible. Bombs meant for rail yards fell into residential zones. High explosives intended for bridges landed on hospitals. In effect, the U.S. raids compounded the devastation rather than directing it. The distinction between precision and area vanished in the reality of fire and rubble. By mid-afternoon, the formations turned away, leaving Dresden in a haze of dust and smoke. Fires rekindled in neighborhoods that had already burned, fanned by the concussion of fresh detonations. Survivors wandered the ruins in shock, their faces gray with soot, their eyes hollow. Some searched desperately for family members. Others stood over the bodies of children or parents with a numb stillness that words could not capture. For many, the daylight raid was harder to comprehend than the night before. The city had already been reduced to ashes. Why strike again? News of Dresden's destruction spread rapidly. Journalists, diplomats, and even some Allied officers began to question the necessity of the raids. In Switzerland, neutral newspapers carried lurid reports of tens of thousands killed, of a city reduced to rubble in a single night and day. In Germany, Nazi propaganda seized on the tragedy, broadcasting images of ruins and corpses as evidence of Anglo-American barbarity. For civilians across Europe, Dresden became a symbol of the horrors of modern warfare, a city whose cultural treasures and innocent lives had been obliterated not in battle, but in fire from the sky. For the Allied High Command, however, the raids were logged and filed like any other operation. The 8th Air Force reported success in striking railway lines and transport hubs. Bomber Command marked Dresden off the list of targets. Yet in the ruins of the city, the reality was starkly different. Survivors dug with bare hands through rubble, searching for the living among the dead. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, leading to mass cremations in public squares. Dresden was not just another raid. It was an inferno that etched itself into history as one of the most devastating aerial assaults ever unleashed. As the sun set on February 14th, the city was silent, but for the crackle of flames and the cries of the wounded. Statues still stood in the ruins, their stone faces gazing across a landscape unrecognizable from the day before. For Dresden, the ordeal was not simply one night of fire, but 2 days of relentless destruction, a storm from which it would never fully recover. In the spring of 1945, weeks after the flames had burned themselves out, Dresden was a city of ghosts. Survivors wandered streets where nothing familiar remained, where Baroque landmarks had been reduced to hollow shells, and entire neighborhoods lay buried beneath rubble. In the Altmarkt, the central square, piles of corpses still smoldered from mass cremations carried out when disease threatened to sweep through the ruins. The air was thick with the smell of ash and decay, a stench that clung to clothing and hair. For those who had lived through the firestorm, the city was no longer the Florence on the Elbe, but a graveyard without boundaries. They spoke of nights spent clawing at bricks to free loved ones, of streets turned into rivers of flame, of silence where once there had been music and laughter. From the moment the fires cooled, questions began to rise. How many had perished in the inferno? Official estimates were uncertain and remain debated to this day. Initial German reports claimed more than 200,000 dead, numbers inflated by Nazi propaganda eager to weaponize the tragedy. Later investigations reduced the figure drastically, with historians generally agreeing on between 20,000 and 25,000 deaths, a toll still staggering, still among the deadliest air raids in history. Yet even as numbers were revised, the horror remained the same. Whether 20,000 or 200,000, the reality was that entire families, neighborhoods, and communities had been extinguished in a matter of hours. The debate extended beyond numbers to the nature of the act itself. Was Dresden a legitimate military target, or had it been a crime against humanity? Allied planners pointed to the city's railways, its communications hubs, and its role in supplying the Eastern Front. They argued that striking Dresden disrupted German troop movements and aided the Red Army's advance. But critics saw something darker, a deliberate attempt to break morale, to punish a city renowned more for its art than its industry, and to make an example of Germany in its final days. The morality of the raids was questioned in newspapers, in parliaments, and in the homes of grieving families across Europe. Even among the Allies, unease grew. Winston Churchill himself, who had once championed the strategic bombing campaign, later wrote uneasily of the appalling destruction at Dresden. In a memorandum, He questioned whether the Allies should not concentrate more on military objectives, rather than on mere acts of terror and wanton destruction. His words revealed the uneasiness that lingered, even in victory. For the Royal Air Force, for Sir Arthur Harris and Bomber Command, Dresden was a mission like many others, a culmination of years of doctrine that treated entire cities as targets. But for the broader world, Dresden became a symbol of what modern war had unleashed, destruction on a scale so vast that morality seemed consumed in its flames. For survivors, the legacy of Dresden was personal and immediate. Many carried the memory of fire and loss for the rest of their lives. Children who had fled cellars with their parents remembered the sound of people screaming as the firestorm pulled them into the flames. Mothers who had survived with one child mourned the others lost to suffocation or collapse. The ruins became a constant reminder, their silhouettes looming over every attempt to rebuild. The Frauenkirche, once the city's crown jewel, stood as a blackened ruin for decades, its broken dome a silent witness to the night of fire. Only after German reunification was it painstakingly rebuilt, its stones, charred and fractured, pieced back together as part of a memorial. Beyond Germany, Dresden's destruction shaped global conversations about the ethics of war. It became a case study in the dangers of total war, where the line between combatant and civilian vanished under tonnage of bombs. The raids were invoked in debates about Hiroshima and Nagasaki later that same year, cited by some as precedent, by others as warning. In the Cold War, Dresden was remembered on both sides of the Iron Curtain, by the East German state as an emblem of Western barbarity, and in the West as a haunting question mark over the conduct of a just war. The charred ruins, preserved for decades, were used as both propaganda and remembrance, depending on who told the story. Today, Dresden stands restored, its skyline once again graced by the Frauenkirche's dome, the Zwinger Palace, and the Semper Opera. Tourists walk streets rebuilt with meticulous care, unaware that beneath their feet lie the ashes of thousands. Memorials dot the city, from plaques on buildings to sculptures marking mass graves. Each February, vigils light the night, candles flickering in silence where once fire consumed everything. The city's recovery is a testament to resilience, but also a warning. The silence of the rebuilt streets contrasts with the roar of that forgotten inferno, reminding all who pass that beauty can vanish in a single night of war. Dresden's legacy is not merely one of tragedy, but of reflection. It asks hard questions about the morality of strategic bombing, about the balance between military necessity and human cost, and about the peril of doctrines that treat cities as weapons. It forces us to reckon with the reality that technology and strategy, once unleashed, can carry consequences that endure long after victory is won. In the end, the ashes of Dresden are not only the remains of a city, but a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both the heights of culture and the depths of destruction.